Part 1: The silence after the guns. The guns fell silent in 1945. Across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, smoke drifted over broken cities, a planet exhaling. After 6 years of total war, men and women stumbled from ruins, waving white flags or tattered photographs. Nations cheered victory. But beneath the celebrations, another kind of silence began to take hold. For the victors, there were parades and medals. For the defeated, trials and tribunals. But in the shadows of both, countless crimes remained unseen, acts so brutal, so inhuman, that entire governments conspired to hide them. The Second World War was not only a clash of armies, it was a collapse of morality, and in its aftermath, truth itself became a battlefield. The Allied forces proclaimed justice at Nuremberg and Tokyo. Yet even as prosecutors recited evidence of unimaginable cruelty, they turned their eyes away from other atrocities committed by those wearing their own uniforms. For the victors, there was the luxury of selective memory. For the victims, only silence. And for history, an unhealed wound, buried beneath official reports and diplomatic files marked classified. What follows are the hidden stories, the massacres erased from textbooks, the experiments never recorded in public archives, and the forgotten pleas for justice that echoed into empty rooms. These are the atrocities the world tried to forget, and the cover-ups that ensured we almost did. Part 2: Shadows of Command. Orders never written. In every war, soldiers act under orders, but in the chaos of World War II, many of the most unspeakable acts had no paper trail, no written commands, no official authorizations. Just implications, winks, and whispers passed through the ranks like poison. They were the orders never written, spoken in guarded language, shielded by the fog of war, and later denied by those who gave them. From Berlin to Tokyo, from the snows of Russia to the jungles of Burma, commanders learned how to kill without leaving evidence. A nod in a meeting, a gesture toward an unarmed crowd, and men understood what was expected of them. The atrocities that followed were not accidents of war, they were policy, disguised as chaos. In Nazi Germany's war machine, the term Bandenbekämpfung, bandit suppression, became a coded phrase for extermination. Entire villages were razed under the pretense of fighting partisans. No documents, no signatures, only the silence of ash and snow. And in the Japanese Empire, a different kind of euphemism took shape. Field orders referred to special treatment for prisoners, a phrase that in truth meant torture, execution, or medical experimentation. By the end of the war, millions had vanished under these invisible directives, their deaths unrecorded, their killers protected by the absence of written proof. After 1945, when Allied investigators demanded evidence, many officers shrugged. They could not produce the orders, and without paper there was no crime. Yet behind those missing documents lay a deeper truth. The greatest atrocities were not committed in defiance of orders, but in obedience to expectations, the kind that needed no ink, only silence. And in that silence, new horrors were already taking shape far from Europe, across the vast territories of Asia. Part 3: The Eastern Inferno. Japan's atrocities in Asia. In Asia, the war began long before Europe was set aflame. WWII. The time the world's attention turned toward Hitler's invasion of Poland, Japan had already been fighting in China for 8 years. But this was not a conventional war, it was a crusade of empire. And behind the banners of the rising sun lay a nightmare few would ever see, and fewer would survive to tell. In December 1937, Japanese troops entered the Chinese capital of Nanking. For 6 weeks, the city became a slaughterhouse. Eyewitnesses described rivers clogged with bodies, entire families executed in cold blood, Western missionaries trapped inside the city, smuggled diaries and photographs to the outside world, but their accounts were dismissed as propaganda. Later estimates would suggest that more than 200,000 civilians were killed, women, children, the elderly, their deaths buried beneath layers of denial and censorship. But even darker secrets lay hidden in the frozen plains of Manchuria. There, in a compound known only by a number unit 731, Japanese scientists conducted human experimentation on prisoners of war and civilians alike. Vivisections without anesthesia, biological weapons tested on living subjects, diseases bred for battlefield use, men, women, even children used as logs, a term the scientists themselves employed to erase their humanity. The data they produced: frostbite studies, plague experiments, gas exposure tests, was later coveted by other nations for its scientific value. And so, when the war ended, Many of Unit 731's leaders were quietly granted immunity in exchange for their research. Justice was sacrificed. For knowledge, from Nanking to the jungles of Burma, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, Japan's imperial army left behind a trail of massacres and starvation, forced labor and death marches that claimed millions of lives. Yet in the official records, many of these crimes were erased, hidden beneath euphemisms like pacification, mopping up, and requisition in the East. As in the West, language became the first weapon of the cover-up. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, the victors promised that all war criminals would face judgment, but soon, politics intervened, and many of the men responsible for these atrocities would go on to hold power in post-war Japan. The truth was simply too dangerous for peace. Part 4: Western Shadows. When the Allies crossed the line in war, history is often written by the victors. But even among the armies that liberated Europe and the Pacific, shadows lingered, acts committed not in the name of tyranny, but in the haze of revenge, fear, and exhaustion. The victors were not immune to the darkness they had sworn to defeat. As Allied troops advanced through Germany in 1945, they uncovered the full horror of the concentration camps, emaciated survivors, piles of the dead, evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. For many soldiers, the shock turned to rage, and in that rage, restraint gave way to retribution. There were executions of captured SS guards without trial. Civilians suspected of collaboration were beaten or shot. Entire villages were accused and punished by soldiers who could no longer tell justice from vengeance. Official reports were often vague. Enemy combatants neutralized, resistance elements removed. But buried beneath those words were unarmed men, and the blur between law and anger. And then there was the sky, where fire itself became a weapon. In February 1945, the Allied bombing of Dresden turned one of Europe's most beautiful cities into an inferno. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in a single night. Many suffocated in bomb shelters as the firestorm consumed all oxygen. The city had limited military value. But by then, revenge had replaced strategy. British and American officials later defended the attack as a necessary blow to morale. But private memos reveal uneasy sense that something sacred had been lost in those flames. In the Pacific, similar lines were crossed. Captured Japanese soldiers, sometimes starving boys of 16, were executed on sight. Civilians fleeing Okinawa were mistaken for enemy forces and gunned down in chaos. Even after Japan's surrender, mass rapes by occupying forces in Asia and Germany remained one of the least discussed crimes of those aftermath omitted from official reports. Silenced by the need to preserve the image of liberation, the victors told the world they had fought for freedom and human rights. And they had. But within those triumphs lived contradictions, a reminder that war corrodes everyone it touches. When judgment finally came at Nuremberg, only one side stood accused. The other stood in silence, hoping its own transgressions would never be remembered. But history does not forget, it merely waits for courage. And as Europe rebuilt from the rubble, a darker chapter unfolded on the Eastern Front, a place where atrocity was not an accident, but a daily language of war. Part 5: Europe's Hidden Hell, Eastern Front Massacres. It was the largest battlefield the world has ever known, a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 3,000 kilometers of mud, fire, and unending death. Here, mercy was the first casualty. The Eastern Front became a war of annihilation, not for territory, but for survival itself. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, he called it Operation Barbarossa. But it was not merely a military campaign, it was an ideological crusade. Nazi command viewed Slavs, Jews, and communists as subhuman obstacles to be erased. Villages were not captured, they were erased. Civilians were not spared, they were classified as partisans. The SS and Satzgruppen mobile killing units followed behind the Wehrmacht. Their orders: exterminate undesirables in ravines, forests, and town squares. Entire communities were executed within hours. WWII. Near KYIV, 33,771 Jews murdered in 2 days. Men, women, infants. No gas chambers, just bullets, shovels, and silence. BY 1943. The German army faced a different horror: the Soviet counterattack. But vengeance breeds vengeance. When the Red Army retook the same villages, they found ashes, graves, and corpses frozen in the earth, and soon, their own soldiers began to repay cruelty with cruelty. In East Prussia, German civilians, women, children, refugees became targets of Soviet revenge. Mass executions, rape, Looting. Eyewitnesses wrote of whole columns of refugees being shelled by Soviet artillery as they fled. German diary read, "They came as liberators, but the faces were not human anymore. Only hate remained ancient. Endless hate in places like Corridor, Zerglein, Lidis, and Kartin. Reprisals blurred all sides. German SS units massacred civilians in retaliation for resistance attacks, while Soviet partisans burned collaborators alive. N01 was untouched. N01 was innocent, and no one remembered the names of the thousands of villages that vanished without maps wiped out so completely that grass grew over there. Graves.by the time the Eastern Front ended. Over 30 million civilians were dead, entire generations erased. To historians, it was a military campaign. To survivors, it was the apocalypse. When peace finally returned, there was no justice big enough for such loss. Only silence. And silence became the only way to endure. But even as the world rebuilt, new atrocities were already being buried not by the defeated, but by the very nations that claimed to have saved civilization. In the Pacific and post-war Asia, justice became selective, truth became political, and secrecy became policy. Next part VI. Justice or cover up. The trials that weren't. Part 6. Justice or cover up. The trials that weren't. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world demanded justice. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. And humanity, for the first time, had to define what war crime truly meant. In November 1945, the Nuremberg trials began. For the first time in history, leaders were held accountable before an international tribunal. 12 major Nazi officials were sentenced to death. The words "crimes against humanity" entered the world's conscience forever, but behind the solemn faces and thunderous speeches, a different story was unfolding, one of power, politics, and selective memory. In the shadows of justice, many of those who built the Nazi war machine quietly recruited by their former enemies. Operation Paperclip, an American program that brought more than 1,600 German scientists to the US, including men who had tested rockets using slave labor at metalwork. Their crimes were ignored, their files sanitized, because in the emerging Cold War, a good scientist was more valuable than a guilty one. In Tokyo, similar compromises took shape. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East prosecuted Japan's top leaders but spared others who possessed secrets the Allies needed. General Ishishiro, head of Unit 731, had overseen human experiments, vivisections without anesthesia, biological weapons tested on prisoners. His crimes were as monstrous as any committed in Europe, but Ishii was never charged. He was given immunity in exchange for sharing his research with the US Army. Justice became a negotiation. Truth became classified. Many victims never saw a courtroom. Entire villages had no representatives. The dead remained voiceless, their stories buried under official secrecy. The trials declared that following orders was no excuse, and yet countless allied war crimes were never even investigated. One stood trial for Dresden, for Hiroshima, for Nagasaki, for the mass rapes in Berlin and Nanjing. These wounds became political taboos, too sensitive for new alliances, too inconvenient for the story of good versus evil. In the West, the trials became a moral foundation, proof that justice had prevailed. But behind that foundation lay cracks, and inside those cracks, the truth about selective justice began to rot. Some historians later asked, was Nuremberg a trial of individuals or a trial for history itself? Because in the years that followed, those same powers would wage new wars, build new weapons, and once again decide who deserved justice and who did not. For those who survived the camps, the massacres, and the experiments, justice was not a verdict. It was a lifetime of waiting for the world to admit victory. Does not erase atrocity, it only buries it deeper. But the cover-ups didn't end with the trials. Governments would go further, burying documents, silencing witnesses, and rewriting archives to preserve their post-war image. Next, Part 7. The secrets they tried to bury. Lost files, hidden archives, and the war on truth. Part 7. The secrets they tried to bury. Lost files, hidden archives, and the war on truth. When the war ended, the world believed that truth had been recorded, that every atrocity had been catalogued, every guilty name preserved. But history is not written in the open. It is edited in the shadows. In the years following 1945, entire archives of evidence vanished. files on Allied bombings, reports of prisoner abuse, documents detailing mass civilian deaths sealed under the label top secret. Governments called it national security, but to survivors, it was simply erasure. In Britain, thousands of colonial and wartime files were deliberately hidden during decolonization. In 2011, researchers discovered the Henslow Park archives a secret vault of over 800 documents detailing torture, massacres, and atrocities from across the empire, including World War II operations. Among them were orders to destroy all compromising material before independence movements could expose them across the Atlantic. The United States sealed thousands of wartime records. Intelligence agencies absorbed captured Nazi and Japanese scientists, but with them came data obtained through human experimentation. Officially, the information didn't exist. Unofficially, it shaped early Cold War biological and chemical programs, even within Germany and Japan. The rewriting began early. School textbooks were cleansed of detail. Mass killings became tragedies of war. Responsibility dissolved into abstraction. In post-war Japan, many former military officers returned quietly to government roles, overseeing the very education system that would teach a generation to forget what they had done. In 1945, as Germany fell, SS units were ordered to burn all incriminating records. Entire offices went up in flames, and when Allied investigators arrived, they found more ashes than answers. The result: millions of dead, and only fragments of the paper trail that proved why. For decades, survivors tried to speak, but often their stories were dismissed as exaggerations, inconsistent memories, or politically inconvenient truths. It would take historians, journalists, and families of the missing to reopen the vaults of silence. In the 1980s and 1992, newly declassified records began to surface. The truth, long buried, emerged one file at a time. Documents proving Allied misconduct in POW camps, evidence of Soviet purges, Japanese Unit 731 records smuggled out by whistleblowers, and yet many archives remain sealed, classified beyond the lifetime of the witnesses themselves. The truth will set you free, but first, it will make you a traitor. Anonymous intelligence officer 1948. For the survivors, truth was not freedom. It was reopening wounds the world wanted to keep closed. And yet, truth has a way of resurfacing, not through governments, but through people. Letters found in attics, diaries hidden beneath floorboards, a photograph, a name, a confession, fragments that rebuild what history tried to erase. But time is running out. Each year, witnesses fade, and the archives remain silent. Before long, the truth of the was hidden atrocities may disappear forever unless we confront it now. Next, we close our journey with a question that defines our humanity. If nations can forget their crimes, what stops history from repeating itself? Part 8: Legacy of Silence. Why remembering still matters. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the war did not truly end. It lived on in the scars, in the silences, in the things people chose not to say. For decades, survivors carried memories that governments tried to bury and societies tried to forget. Some wrote letters that were never sent. Some told their stories once and never again. Others left only a silence that spoke louder than any testimony. Every nation has its ghosts, and every generation inherits the silence of the one before. But silence is not peace. It is the soil in which denial grows. Children born after the war grew up surrounded by monuments and photographs, but rarely by truth. The horrors their parents saw were locked behind closed doors, and so the trauma echoed quietly from one generation to the next. Today, the few who remain speak not for vengeance, but for remembrance, because memory is not about reliving the past, it is about preventing its return. Across the world, archives are being reopened. New generations are asking questions that their grandparents were told not to ask. In classrooms, in documentaries, in fading testimonies, the truth is being pieced together, one voice at a time. If you forget us, then we will die a second time. Those words are not a plea, they are a warning, because forgetting is how history begins again. World War II taught humanity what it was capable of: the brilliance of sacrifice and the abyss of cruelty. But its hidden atrocities remind us that evil does not vanish with victory. It waits in complacency, in silence, In the spaces where truth is too painful to face. To remember is not to accuse. It is to understand. To honor not just those who fought, but those who were forgotten by both sides. Every file unsealed, every name restored, every story told is an act of rebellion against oblivion. History cannot heal us, but truth can stop the wound from spreading. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayanathis is not the end of the story. It is an invitation to learn, to question, to speak where silence once ruled, because remembering is not just history. It is resistance. This has been World War II's Secret Atrocities. Hidden war crimes the world tried to forget. If you believe truth still matters, share their stories, keep their names alive, and never, ever let silence win. Subscribe for more untold stories of World War II. Comment your thoughts. Every voice helps preserve history. New episodes every 2 days, uncovering truth, one story at a time.